It is to be the biggest reform of industrial relation laws in 30 years. The trade union bill unveiled today will tighten the rules on strike ballots, forcing unions to give employers 14 days' notice of action and allowing firms to bring in agency workers to replace striking staff. With new curbs too on political donations, Labour and the unions are already branding it partisan and vindictive. The government says it's simply balancing the right to strike with the rights of others to go about their daily lives. Michael Crick has this.
And now I'm going to ask for a vote.
The crowd surged forward.
For much of the last century, organised labour was a force in the land. Industrial disputes dominated our politics.
Miners say he was truncheoned by the police.
Until curbed in the 80s by unemployment and the Thatcher anti-union laws. Now ministers plan to go further still. This bill contains a whole range of measures which will inevitably make life that much more difficult for the Labour movement, both the unions and the Labour Party. The headline, a move to make strikes harder. Now, strikes have long required a ballot before they can go ahead, but now the government's saying that at least 50% of the workforce should have participated in that ballot before it's valid. And in public services deemed essential, like schools, health and transport, a strike will only be legal if 40% of the workforce vote for it.
We live in a free country, so I think, they should always have that leeway, freedom to strike if they want to.
To pay bills, they should be allowed to strike for better money.
But shouldn't at least half the workforce participate in a strike ballot before it's valid?
Yes, I agree with that.
This is loading the dice against working people, and it will make it much harder for nurses, midwives, firefighters to defend jobs and services.
But if a strike is just, surely there would be no problem in the world about getting 40% of the workforce to vote for it.
The problem with the government's proposal is that it turns an abstention into a no vote.
Last week's strikes on the London Tube and the railways showed the unions can still cause huge disruption, though barely 700,000 working days were lost through industrial disputes last year, a tiny fraction of the norm in the 70s and 80s.
Well, this is actually a reasonably modest reform. There are relatively few strikes that actually fail to meet these thresholds. Because I think in certain cases, I'll give you a good example. In the NHS last year, there was a strike called by Unite. Unite secured the support of 10% of its members, but went ahead with a strike that would have led to cancelled operations, cancelled appointments for people who've been waiting months for them.
Today's other big move will force unions to ask members one by one if they want to pay into their political funds, rather than let them opt out, as now. That's bound to hit funding of the Labour Party.
It's not acceptable for him to be curbing funds from hard-working people to the Labour Party while turning a blind eye to donations from hedge funds to the Tories.
If you want to give money to a party, it should be an act of free will, not something that is taken out of your pay packet without you being told about it properly.
But some see today's measures, combined with changes to the BBC, moves on English votes for English laws and new constituency boundaries, as one big effort to achieve long-term Tory supremacy, while Labour is still reeling from the election.
So now let's return to our main news tonight and the government's plans for new laws tightening the rules surrounding trade unions and industrial action. With me now to discuss the changes, rather ironically given that fire alarm, is Lucy Massoud from the London Fire Brigades Union. And we're joined from Westminster by the Conservative MP, Bob Blackman. Lucy Massoud first. 700,000 working days lost to strike action in the last year. If you're a parent whose school teachers are going on, whose kids' school teachers are going on strike, or a tube user struggling to get to work in London, that's pretty inconvenient, isn't it?
I'm sure it may well be inconvenient to them, but what I would say to the general public is when we do go on strike, we do it with a very heavy heart. I'm a firefighter. I've been a firefighter for 10 years. I did not join the London Fire Brigade to go on strike. I joined the London Fire Brigade so I could help people and I could save lives. And on a daily basis, I put my life on the line to help other people. So when we do go on strike, it's always, always a last resort, an absolute last resort.
Bob Blackman, striking is always a last resort there. You heard it there. And actually, compared to the 1970s, when there were, 13 million working days lost to strikes a year, I mean, it's really increasingly a thing of the past, isn't it?
I wish it was. I mean, the reality is that last week demonstrated on London Underground with 5 separate unions coming together and paralysing the network, how inconvenient it is then for Londoners to go to and from work. And the reality is that these particular strikes are being taken while negotiations and mediation are still going on. I would take the view that strike action should be absolutely the last resort, not a negotiating tactic, which appears to be the basis on which is going on the London Underground.
We've just heard Lucy Massoud say that strikes are a last resort already.
Well, I don't think that's the case. I mean, clearly that's not the case in London Underground, and I think the key point here is that in essential services that the public depend upon for their daily lives, it's quite right that we have very high thresholds for ballots on strike action, and to make sure that people who are doing those jobs positively decide that they want to go on strike and withdraw their labour for, after all, the services that they have chosen as their careers to give their services to the public.
Lucy Massoud?
Well, I mean, if we applied what Mr Blackman's saying about this high threshold of 40% of the eligible voter, if we applied that to his own job, he wouldn't actually be sitting there today because he didn't achieve that 40% of his own eligible voting constituency. In fact, the Mayor of London only got a 35% turnout at his election. So why is it one rule for the politician and one rule for us?
Mr Blackman?
Well, quite. I mean, I actually got 50.3% of the vote.
But the Conservatives had just 37% of the vote. I mean, what kind of mandate do you have to do this?
The key point here is that everyone in the country had the right to vote at the general election. Those that chose to do so did. Several people abstained. What we're saying here is that when you withdraw your labour, when you take strike action against the people for whom you're serving, there should be a strong mandate to achieve that. Now, I think most members of the public would say, well, 50% of the turnout would be reasonable. The reality is that in a general election, if you're going to make those comparisons, we are up around 70-odd% of the electorate voting. And so clearly that is a reasonable position to take. And equally, in essential public services, I don't think it's unreasonable that 40% of the members should actually say positively they want to go on strike and withdraw their labour.
OK, 37% of people voted for the Conservatives, so you fail on your own threshold there. But let me just ask you this. It's fine for you sitting pretty on your £67,000 a year salary plus expenses, but what about the people who are paid far less? I think, just turning to Lucy Massoud, £26,000 a year for a firefighter, right?
Yes.
So what's your reaction to that?
Well, the £26,000 is the average salary in the UK. But equally, what we're talking about, and what I was raising quite clearly today in Parliament, was that we have underground train drivers who are on £50,000 a year, choosing to go on strike and withdraw their labour from providing a service to the people that they are there to serve. I mean, quite clearly there's a position...
That point to Lucy Massoud. The tube drivers, £52,000 a year basic salary. It's twice the median wage, isn't it?
Well, I'd never begrudge anyone their wage. And just a quick point, Mr Blackman didn't receive 51% of the eligible vote of his constituency. He received 35%.
But you don't begrudge him his £67,000 wage?
He has the opportunity to claim expenses, which he's done, which we've all read about. I don't have the opportunity to claim such expenses. I would say he's being quite disingenuous, and the government bill is being very disingenuous. I think, excuse me, this is an opportunity for the government to try and castrate trade unions. They don't really care about what the voter turnout is. We've put many suggestions to the government. We've said we support supervised ballots in the workplace. If we did that, that would automatically increase voter turnout. We've suggested text message voting. We've suggested internet voting. All these proposals have been rejected by this Conservative government. That tells me that what this Conservative government are trying to do is castrate the trade union, take away our ability to strike, and allow the government to carry on with their savage cuts of the public sector.
Lucy Massoud, Bob Blackman, thank you very much for joining us.